"My lord," replied the boy in tones of gratitude, "wasn't it my place to do it? Thalcave has saved my life already, and you are going to save my father." Chapter 20, Strange Signs. After the first joy of the meeting was over, Paganel and his party, except perhaps the major, were only conscious of one feeling: they were dying of thirst. Most fortunately for them, the Guamini ran not far off, and about 7 in the morning the little troop reached the enclosure on its banks. The precincts were strewed with the dead wolves, and judging from their numbers, it was evident how violent the attack must have been, and how desperate the resistance. As soon as the travelers had drunk their fill, they began to demolish the breakfast prepared in the ramada, and did ample justice to the extraordinary viands. The Nandu fillets were pronounced first-rate, and the armadillo was delicious. "To eat moderately," said Paganel, "would be positive ingratitude to Providence. We must eat immoderately." And so they did, but were none the worse for it. The water of the Guamini greatly aided digestion apparently. Glenarvan, however, was not going to imitate Hannibal at Capua, and at 10 o'clock next morning gave the signal for starting. The leathern bottles were filled with water, and the day's march commenced. The horses were so well rested that they were quite fresh again, and kept up a canter almost constantly. The country was not so parched up now, and consequently less sterile, but still a desert. No incident occurred of any importance during the 2D and of November, and in the evening they reached the boundary of the Pampas, and camped for the night on the frontiers of the province of Buenos Aires. Two-thirds of their journey was now accomplished. It was 22 days since they left the Bay of Talcahuano, and they had gone 450 miles. Next morning they crossed the conventional line which separates the Argentine plains from the region of the Pampas. It was here that Thalcave hoped to meet the caciques, in whose hands, he had no doubt, Harry Grant and his men were prisoners. From the time of leaving the Guamini, there was marked change in the temperature, to the great relief of the travelers. It was much cooler, thanks to the violent and cold winds from Patagonia, which constantly agitate the atmospheric waves. Horses and men were glad enough of this, after what they had suffered from the heat and drought, and they felt animated with fresh ardor and confidence. But contrary to what Thalcave had said, the whole district appeared uninhabited, or rather abandoned. Their route often led past or went right through small lagoons, sometimes of fresh water, sometimes of brackish. On the banks and bushes about these, king wrens were hopping about and larks singing joyously in concert with the tangaras, the rivals in color of the brilliant hummingbirds. On the thorny bushes the nests of the anubis swung to and fro in the breeze like an Indian hammock, and on the shore magnificent flamingos stalked in regular order like soldiers marching, and spread out their flaming red wings. Their nests were seen in groups of thousands, forming a complete town, about a foot high, and resembling a truncated cone in shape. The flamingos did not disturb themselves in the least at the approach of the travelers, but this did not suit Paganel. "I have been very desirous a long time," he said to the major, "to see a flamingo flying." "All right," replied McNabbs. "Now while I have the opportunity, I should like to make the most of it," continued Paganel. "Very well, do it, Paganel. Come with me then, Major, and you too, Robert, I want witnesses." And all three went off towards the flamingos, leaving the others to go on in advance. As soon as they were near enough, Paganel fired, only loading his gun, however, with powder, for he would not shed even the blood of a bird uselessly. The shot made the whole assemblage fly away en masse, while Paganel watched them attentively through his spectacles. "Well, did you see them fly?" he asked the major. "Certainly I did," was the reply. "I could not help seeing them unless I had been blind." "Well, and did you think they resembled feathered arrows when they were flying?" "Not in the least." "Not a bit," added Robert. "I was sure of it," said the geographer with a satisfied air. "And yet the very proudest of modest men, my illustrious countryman, Chateaubriand, made the inaccurate comparison. Oh, Robert, comparison is the most dangerous figure in rhetoric that I know. Mind you avoid it all your life and only employ it in a last extremity." "Are you satisfied with your experiment?" asked McNabbs. "Delighted." "And so am I, but we had better push on now, for your illustrious Chateaubriand has put us more than a mile behind." On rejoining their companions, they found Glenarvan busily engaged in conversation with the Indian, though apparently unable to make him understand. Thalcave's gaze was fixed intently on the horizon, and his face wore a puzzled expression. The moment Paganel came in sight, Glenarvan called out, Come along, friend Paganel. Thalcave and I can't understand each other at all. After a few minutes' talk with the Patagonian, the interpreter turned to Glenarvan and said, Thalcave is quite astonished at the fact, and certainly it is very strange that there are no Indians, nor even traces of any to be seen in these plains, for they are generally thick with companies of them, either driving along cattle stolen from the estancias, or going to the Andes to sell their zorillo cloths and plated leather whips. And what does Thalcave think is the reason? He does not know, he is amazed and that's all. But what description of Indians did he reckon on meeting in this part of the Pampas? Just the very ones who had the foreign prisoners in their hands, the natives under the rule of the caciques Cafocura, Catriel, or Yanchitras. Who are these caciques? Chiefs that were all powerful 30 years ago, before they were driven beyond the Sierras. Since then, they have been reduced to subjection as much as Indians can be, and they scour the plains of the Pampas and the province of Buenos Aires. I quite share Thalcave's surprise at not discovering any traces of them in regions which they usually infest as saltidors or bandits. And what must we do then? I'll go and ask him, replied Paganel. After a brief colloquy, he returned and said, This is his advice, and very sensible it is, I think. He says we had better continue our route to the east as far as Fort Independence, and if we don't get news of Captain Grant there we shall hear, at any rate, what has become of the Indians of the Argentine plains. Is Fort Independence far away? Asked Glenarvan. No, it is in the Sierra Tandil, a distance of about 60 miles. And when shall we arrive? The day after tomorrow, in the evening. Glenarvan was considerably disconcerted by this circumstance. Not to find an Indian where in general there were only too many was so unusual that there must be some grave cause for it. But worse still if Harry Grant were a prisoner in the hands of any of those tribes, had he been dragged away with them to the north or south? Glenarvan felt that, cost what it might, they must not lose his track, and therefore decided to follow the advice of Thalcave and go to the village of Tandil. They would find someone there to speak to, at all events. About 4 o'clock in the evening, a hill, which seemed a mountain in so flat a country, was sighted in the distance. This was Sierra Tapalquem, at the foot of which the travelers camped that night. The passage in the morning over the Sierra was accomplished without the slightest difficulty. After having crossed the Cordillera of the Andes, it was easy work to ascend the gentle heights of such a sierra as this. The horses scarcely slackened their speed. At noon they passed the deserted fort of Tapalquem, the first of the chain of forts which defend the southern frontiers from Indian marauders. But to the increasing surprise of Thalcave, they did not come across even the shadow of an Indian. About the middle of the day, however, 3 flying horsemen, well mounted and well armed, came in sight, gazed at them for an instant, and then sped away with inconceivable rapidity. Glenarvan was furious. Gauchos, said the Patagonian, designating them by the name which had caused such a fiery discussion between the Major and Paganel. Ah, the Gauchos, replied McNabbs. Well, Paganel, the north wind is not blowing today. What do you think of those fellows yonder? I think they look like regular bandits. And how far is it from looking to being, my good geographer? Only just a step, my dear Major. Paganel's admission was received with a general laugh, which did not in the least disconcert him. He went on talking about the Indians, however, and made this curious observation. I have read somewhere, he said, that about the Arabs there is a peculiar expression of ferocity in the mouth, while the eyes have a kindly look. Now, in these American savages it is quite the reverse, for the eye has a particularly villainous aspect. No physiognomist by profession could have better characterized the Indian race. But desolate as the country appeared, Thalcave was on his guard against surprises, and gave orders to his party to form themselves in a close platoon. It was a useless precaution, however, for that same evening they camped for the night in an immense tolderia, which they not only found perfectly empty, but which the Patagonian declared, after he had examined it all round, must have been uninhabited for a long time. Next day, the first estancias of the Sierra Tandil came in sight. The estancias are large cattle stations for breeding cattle, but Thalcave resolved not to stop at any of them, but to go straight on to Fort Independence. They passed several farms fortified by battlements and surrounded by a deep moat, the principal building being encircled by a terrace, from which the inhabitants could fire down on the marauders in the plain. Glenarvan might perhaps have got some information at these houses, but it was the surest plan to go straight on to the village of Tandil. Accordingly, they went on without stopping, fording the Rio of Los Huasos and also the Chapilafu, a few miles further on. Soon they were treading the grassy slopes of the first ridges of the Sierra Tandil, and an hour afterward the village appeared in the depths of a narrow gorge, and above it towered the lofty battlements of Fort Independence. Chapter 21, A False Trail. The Sierra Tandil rises 1,000 feet above the level of the sea. It is a primordial chain, that is to say, anterior to all organic and metamorphic creation. It is formed of a semicircular ridge of gneiss hills, covered with fine short grass. The district of Tandil, to which it has given its name, includes all the south of the province of Buenos Aires and terminates in a river which conveys north all the rios that take their rise on its slopes. After making a short ascent up the Sierra, they reached the postern gate, so carelessly guarded by an Argentine sentinel that they passed through without difficulty, a circumstance which betokened extreme negligence or extreme security. A few minutes afterward the commandant appeared in person. He was a vigorous man about 50 years of age, of military aspect, with grayish hair and an imperious eye, as far as one could see through the clouds of tobacco smoke which escaped from his short pipe. His walk reminded Paganel instantly of the old subalterns in his own country. Thalcave was spokesman, and addressing the officer, presented Lord Glenarvan and his companions. While he was speaking, the commandant kept staring fixedly at Paganel in rather an embarrassing manner. The geographer could not understand what he meant by it, and was just about to interrogate him, when the commandant came forward, and seizing both his hands in the most free and easy fashion, said in a joyous voice, in the mother tongue of the geographer, "A Frenchman." "Yes, a Frenchman," replied Paganel. "Ah, delightful. Welcome, welcome. I am a Frenchman too," he added, shaking Paganel's hand with such vigor as to be almost alarming. "Is he a friend of yours, Paganel?" asked the major. "Yes," said Paganel, somewhat proudly. "One has friends in every division of the globe." After he had succeeded in disengaging his hand, though not without difficulty, from the living vice in which it was held, a lively conversation ensued. Glenarvan would fain have put in a word about the business on hand, but the commandant related his entire history, and was not in a mood to stop till he had done. It was evident that the worthy man must have left his native country many years back, for his mother tongue had grown unfamiliar, and if he had not forgot the words, he certainly did not remember how to put them together. He spoke more like a Negro belonging to a French colony. The fact was that the governor of Fort Independence was a French sergeant, an old comrade of Parachapi. He had never left the fort since it had been built in 1828, and, strange to say, he commanded it with the consent of the Argentine government. He was a man about 50 years of age, a Basque by birth, and his name was Manuel Ifereger, so that he was almost a Spaniard. A year after his arrival in the country he was naturalized, took service in the Argentine army, and married an Indian girl, who was then nursing twin babies 6 months old, 2 boys, be it understood, for the good wife of the commandant would have never thought of presenting her husband with girls. Manuel could not conceive of any state but a military one, and he hoped in due time, with the help of God, to offer the Republic a whole company of young soldiers. You saw them, charming. Good soldiers are Jose, Juan, and Miguel. Pepe's 7-year-old Pepe can handle a gun. Pepe, hearing himself complimented, brought his 2 little feet together, and presented arms with perfect grace. "He'll get on," added the sergeant. "He'll be colonel major or brigadier general some day." Sergeant Manuel seemed so enchanted that it would have been useless to express a contrary opinion, either to the profession of arms or the probable future of his children. He was happy, and as Goethe says, "Nothing that makes us happy is an illusion." All this talk took up a quarter of an hour, to the great astonishment of Thalcave. The Indian could not understand how so many words could come out of one throat. No one interrupted the sergeant, but all things come to an end, and at last he was silent, but not till he had made his guests enter his dwelling and be presented to Madame Ifereger. Then, and not till then, did he ask his guests what had procured him the honor of their visit. Now or never was the moment to explain, and Paganel, seizing the chance at once, began an account of their journey across the Pampas, and ended by inquiring the reason of the Indians having deserted the country. "Ah, there was no one," replied the sergeant, shrugging his shoulders, "really no one, and us two, our arms crossed, nothing to do." "But why?" "War. War." Yes, civil war between the Paraguayans and Buenos Aires, replied the sergeant. Well, well, Indians all in the north, in the rear of General Flores. Indian pillagers find pillage there. But where are the caciques? Caciques are with them. What's catriel? There is no catriel. And Cafokura. There is no Cafokura. And is there no Yanchitras? No, no Yanchitras. The reply was interpreted by Thalcave, who shook his head and gave an approving look. The Patagonian was either unaware of, or had forgotten that civil war was decimating the two parts of the Republic, a war which ultimately required the intervention of Brazil. The Indians have everything to gain by these intestine strifes and cannot lose such fine opportunities of plunder. There was no doubt the sergeant was right in assigning war then as the cause of the forsaken appearance of the plains. But this circumstance upset all Glenarvan's projects, for if Harry Grant was a prisoner in the hands of the caciques, he must have been dragged north with them. How and where should they ever find him if that were the case? Should they attempt a perilous and almost useless journey to the northern border of the Pampas? It was a serious question which would need to be well talked over. However, there was one inquiry more to make to the sergeant, and it was the major who thought of it, for all the others looked at each other in silence. Had the sergeant heard whether any Europeans were prisoners in the hands of the caciques? Manuel looked thoughtful for a few minutes, like a man trying to ransack his memory. At last he said, "Yes." "Ah," said Glenarvan, catching at the fresh hope. They all eagerly crowded round the sergeant, exclaiming, "Tell us, tell us." "It was some years ago," replied Manuel. "Yes, all I heard was that some Europeans were prisoners, but I never saw them." "You are making a mistake," said Glenarvan. "It can't be some years ago. The date of the shipwreck is explicitly given. The Britannia was wrecked in June, 1862. It is scarcely 2 years ago." "Oh, more than that, my lord." "Impossible," said Paganel. "Oh, but it must be. It was when Pepe was born. There were two prisoners." "No, three," said Glenarvan. "Two," replied the sergeant in a positive tone. "Two," echoed Glenarvan, much surprised. "Two Englishmen." "No, no, who is talking of Englishmen? No, a Frenchman and an Italian." "An Italian who was massacred by the Poyaches?" exclaimed Paganel. "Yes, and I heard afterward that the Frenchman was saved." "Saved?" exclaimed young Robert, his very life hanging on the lips of the sergeant. "Yes, delivered out of the hands of the Indians." Paganel struck his forehead with an air of desperation, and said at last, "Ah, I understand. It is all clear now, everything is explained." "But what is it?" asked Glenarvan with as much impatience. "My friends," replied Paganel, taking both Robert's hands in his own, "we must resign ourselves to a sad disaster. We have been on a wrong track. The prisoner mentioned is not the captain at all, but one of my own countrymen, and his companion, who was assassinated by the Poyaches, was Marco Vasilo. The Frenchman was dragged along by the cruel Indians several times as far as the shores of the Colorado, but managed at length to make his escape, and returned to Colorado. Instead of following the track of Harry Grant, we have fallen on that of young Ginnard." This announcement was heard with profound silence. The mistake was palpable. The details given by the sergeant, the nationality of the prisoner, the murder of his companions, his escape from the hands of the Indians, all evidenced the fact. Glenarvan looked at Thalcave with a crestfallen face, and the Indian, turning to the sergeant, asked whether he had never heard of 3 English captives. "Never," replied Manuel. "They would have known of them at Tandil, I am sure. No, it cannot be." After this, there was nothing further to do at Fort Independence but to shake hands with the commandant, and thank him and take leave. Glenarvan was in despair at this complete overthrow of his hopes, and Robert walked silently beside him, with his eyes full of tears. Glenarvan could not find a word of comfort to say to him. Paganel gesticulated and talked away to himself. The major never opened his mouth, nor Thalcave, whose amour propre as an Indian, seemed quite wounded by having allowed himself to go on a wrong scent. No one, however, would have thought of reproaching him for an error so pardonable. They went back to the fonda and had supper, but it was a gloomy party that surrounded the table. It was not that any one of them regretted the fatigue they had so heedlessly endured or the dangers they had run. But they felt their hope of success was gone, for there was no chance of coming across Captain Grant between the Sierra Tandil and the sea, as Sergeant Manuel must have heard if any prisoners had fallen into the hands of the Indians on the coast of the Atlantic. Any event of this nature would have attracted the notice of the Indian traders who traffic between Tandil and Carmen at the mouth of the Rio Negro. The best thing to do now was to get to the Duncan as quick as possible at the appointed rendezvous. Paganel asked Glenarvan, however, to let him have the document again, on the faith of which they had set out on so bootless a search. He read it over and over, as if trying to extract some new meaning out of it. "Yet nothing can be clearer," said Glenarvan. "It gives the date of the shipwreck and the manner and the place of the captivity in the most categorical manner." "That it does not know, it does not," exclaimed Paganel, striking the table with his fist. "Since Harry Grant is not in the Pampas, he is not in America, but where he is the document must say, and it shall say, my friends, or my name is not Jacques Paganel any longer." Chapter 22, The Flood. A distance of 150 miles separates Fort Independence from the shores of the Atlantic. Unless unexpected and certainly improbable delays should occur, in 4 days Glenarvan would rejoin the Duncan, but to return on board without Captain Grant, and after having so completely failed in his search, was what he could not bring himself to do. Consequently, when next day came, he gave no orders for departure. The Major took it upon himself to have the horses saddled and make all preparations. Thanks to his activity, next morning at 8 o'clock the little troop was descending the grassy slopes of the Sierra. Glenarvan, with Robert at his side, galloped along without saying a word. His bold, determined nature made it impossible to take failure quietly. His heart throbbed as if it would burst, and his head was burning. Paganel, excited by the difficulty, was turning over and over the words of the document and trying to discover some new meaning. Thalcave was perfectly silent and left Thayuka to lead the way. The Major, always confident, remained firm at his post, like a man on whom discouragement takes no hold. Tom Austin and his 2 sailors shared the dejection of their master. A timid rabbit happened to run across their path, and the superstitious men looked at each other in dismay. "A bad omen," said Wilson. "Yes, in the Highlands," repeated Mulready. "What's bad in the Highlands is not better here," returned Wilson sententiously. Toward noon they had crossed the Sierra and descended into the undulating plains which extend to the sea. Limpid rios intersected these plains and lost themselves among the tall grasses. The ground had once more become a dead level, the last mountains of the Pampas were passed, and a long carpet of verdure unrolled itself over the monotonous prairie beneath the horses' tread. Hitherto the weather had been fine, but today the sky presented anything but a reassuring appearance. The heavy vapors, generated by the high temperature of the preceding days, hung in thick clouds, which ere long would empty themselves in torrents of rain. Moreover, the vicinity of the Atlantic and the prevailing west wind made the climate of this district particularly damp. This was evident by the fertility and abundance of the pasture and its dark color. However, the clouds remained unbroken for the present, and in the evening, after a brisk gallop of 40 miles, the horses stopped on the brink of deep Canadas, immense natural trenches filled with water. No shelter was near, and ponchos had to serve both for tents and coverlets as each man lay down and fell asleep beneath the threatening sky. Next day the presence of water became still more sensibly felt. It seemed to exude from every pore of the ground. Soon large ponds, some just beginning to form and some already deep, lay across the route to the east. As long as they had only to deal with lagoons, circumscribed pieces of water unencumbered with aquatic plants, the horses could get through well enough. But when they encountered moving sloughs called pantanos, it was harder work. Tall grass blocked them up, and they were involved in the peril before they were aware. These bogs had already proved fatal to more than one living thing, for Robert, who had got a good bit ahead of the party, came rushing back at full gallop, calling out, Monsieur Paganel, a forest of horns." "What?" exclaimed the geographer. "You have found a forest of horns." "Yes, yes, or at any rate a coppice." "A coppice," replied Paganel, shrugging his shoulders. "My boy, you are dreaming." "I am not dreaming, and you will see for yourself. Well, this is a strange country. They sow horns and they sprout up like wheat. I wish I could get some of the seed." "The boy is really speaking seriously," said the Major. "Yes, Mr. Major, and you will soon see I am right." The boy had not been mistaken, for presently they found themselves in front of an immense field of horns, regularly planted and stretching far out of sight. It was a complete copse, low and close packed, but a strange sort. "Well," said Robert. "This is peculiar certainly," said Paganel, and he turned round to question Thalcave on the subject. "The horns come out of the ground," replied the Indian, "but the oxen are down below." "What?" exclaimed Paganel. "Do you mean to say that a whole herd was caught in that mud and buried alive?" "Yes," said the Patagonian. And so it was. An immense herd had been suffocated side by side in this enormous bog, and this was not the first occurrence of the kind which had taken place in the Argentine plains. An hour afterward, and the field of horns lay 2 miles behind. Thalcave was somewhat anxiously observing a state of things which appeared to him unusual. He frequently stopped and raised himself on his stirrups and looked around. His great height gave him a commanding view of the whole horizon, but after a keen, rapid survey, he quickly resumed his seat and went on. About a mile further he stopped again, and leaving the straight route, made a circuit of some miles north and south, and then returned and fell back in his place at the head of the troop, without saying a syllable as to what he hoped or feared. This strange behavior, several times repeated, made Glenarvan very uneasy and quite puzzled Paganel. At last, at Glenarvan's request, he asked the Indian about it. Thalcave replied that he was astonished to see the plains so saturated with water. Never, to his knowledge, since he had followed the calling of guide, had he found the ground in this soaking condition. Even in the rainy season, the Argentine plains had always been passable. "But what is the cause of this increasing humidity?" said Paganel. "I do not know, and what if I did? Could it be owing to the rios of the Sierra being swollen to overflowing by the heavy rains? Sometimes they are. And is it the case now? Perhaps." Paganel was obliged to be content with this unsatisfactory reply, and went back to Glenarvan to report the result of his conversation. "And what does Thalcave advise us to do?" said Glenarvan. Paganel went back to the guide and asked him. "Go on fast," was the reply. This was easier said than done. The horses soon tired of treading over ground that gave way at every step. It sank each moment more and more, till it seemed half under water. They quickened their pace, but could not go fast enough to escape the water, which rolled in great sheets at their feet. Before 2 hours, the cataracts of the sky opened and deluged the plain in true tropical torrents of rain. Never was there a finer occasion for displaying philosophically equanimity. There was no shelter, and nothing for it but to bear it stolidly. The ponchos were streaming like the overflowing gutter spouts on the roof of a house, and the unfortunate horsemen had to submit to a double bath, for their horses dashed up the water to their waists at every step. In this drenching, shivering state, and worn out with fatigue, they came toward evening to a miserable rancho, which could only have been called a shelter by people not very fastidious, and certainly only travelers in extremity would even have entered it. But Glenarvan and his companions had no choice, and were glad enough to burrow in this wretched hovel, though it would have been despised by even a poor Indian of the Pampas. A miserable fire of grass was kindled, which gave out more smoke than heat, and was very difficult to keep alight, as the torrents of rain which dashed against the ruined cabin outside found their way within and fell down in large drops from the roof. 20 times over the fire would have been extinguished if Mulready and Wilson had not kept off the water. The supper was a dull meal, and neither appetizing nor reviving. Only the Major seemed to eat with any relish. The impassive McNabbs was superior to all circumstances. Paganel, Frenchman as he was, tried to joke, but the attempt was a failure. "My jests are damp," he said, "they misfire." The only consolation in such circumstances was to sleep, and accordingly each one lay down and endeavored to find in slumber a temporary forgetfulness of his discomforts and his fatigues. The night was stormy, and the planks of the rancho cracked before the blast as if every instant they would give way. The poor horses outside, exposed to all the inclemency of the weather, were making piteous moans, and their masters were suffering quite as much inside the ruined rancho. However, sleep overpowered them at length. Robert was the first to close his eyes and lean his head against Glenarvan's shoulder, and soon all the rest were soundly sleeping too under the guardian eye of heaven. The night passed safely, and no one stirred till Thayuk awoke them by tapping vigorously against the rancho with his hoof. He knew it was time to start, and at a push could give the signal as well as his master. They owed the faithful creature too much to disobey him, and set off immediately. The rain had abated, but floods of water still covered the ground. Paganel, on consulting his map, came to the conclusion that the Rios Grande and Vivarota, into which the water from the plains generally runs, must have been united in one large bed several miles in extent. Extreme haste was imperative, for all their lives depended on it. Should the inundation increase, where could they find refuge? Not a single elevated point was visible on the whole circle of the horizon, and on such level plains, water would sweep along with fearful rapidity. The horses were spurred on to the utmost, and Thayuka led the way, bounding over the water as if it had been his natural element. Certainly, he might justly have been called a seahorse, better than many of the amphibious animals who bear that name. All of a sudden, about 10 in the morning, Thayuka betrayed symptoms of violent agitation. He kept turning round toward the south, neighing continually and snorting with wide-open nostrils. He reared violently, and Thalcave had some difficulty in keeping his seat. The foam from his mouth was tinged with blood from the action of the bit, pulled tightly by his master's strong hand, and yet the fiery animal would not be still. Had he been free, his master knew he would have fled away to the north as fast as his legs would have carried him. "What is the matter with Thayuka?" asked Paganel. "Is he bitten by the leeches? They are very voracious in the Argentine streams." "No," replied the Indian. "Is he frightened at something, then?" "Yes, he sensed danger." "What danger?" "I don't know." But though no danger was apparent to the eye, the ear could catch the sound of a murmuring noise beyond the limits of the horizon, like the coming in of the tide. Soon a confused sound was heard of bellowing and neighing and bleating, and about a mile to the south, immense flocks appeared, rushing and tumbling over each other in the greatest disorder, as they hurried pell-mell along with inconceivable rapidity. They raised such a whirlwind of water in their course that it was impossible to distinguish them clearly. 100 whales of the largest size could hardly have dashed up the ocean waves more violently. "Anda, anda, quick, quick," shouted Thalcave in a voice like thunder. "What is it, then?" asked Paganel. "The rising," replied Thalcave. "He means an inundation," exclaimed Paganel, flying with the others after Thalcave, who had spurred on his horse toward the north. It was high time, for about 5 miles south an immense towering wave was seen advancing over the plain and changing the whole country into an ocean. The tall grass disappeared before it as if cut down by a scythe, and clumps of mimosas were torn up and drifted about like floating islands. The wave was speeding on with the rapidity of a racehorse, and the travelers fled before it like a cloud before a storm wind. They looked in vain for some harbor of refuge, and the terrified horses galloped so wildly along that the riders could hardly keep their saddles. "Anda, anda," shouted Thalcave, and again they spurred on the poor animals till the blood ran from their lacerated sides. They stumbled every now and then over great cracks in the ground, or got entangled in the hidden grass below the water. They fell, and were pulled up only to fall again and again, and be pulled up again and again. The level of the waters was sensibly rising, and less than 2 miles off the gigantic wave reared its crested head. For a quarter of an hour this supreme struggle with the most terrible of elements lasted. The fugitives could not tell how far they had gone, but, judging by the speed, the distance must have been considerable. The poor horses, however, were breast-high in water now, and could only advance with extreme difficulty. Glenarvan and Paganel, and indeed the whole party, gave themselves up for lost, as the horses were fast getting out of their depth, and 6 feet of water would be enough to drown them. It would be impossible to tell the anguish of mind these 8 men endured. They felt their own impotence in the presence of these cataclysms of nature so far beyond all human power. Their salvation did not lie in their own hands. 5 minutes afterward, and the horses were swimming. The current alone carried them along with tremendous force, and with a swiftness equal to their fastest gallop. They must have gone fully 20 miles an hour. All hope of delivery seemed impossible, when the major suddenly called out, "A tree!" "A tree!" exclaimed Glenarvan. "Yes, there," replied Thalcave, pointing with his finger to a species of gigantic walnut tree, which raised its solitary head above the waters. His companions needed no urging forward now. This tree, so opportunely discovered, they must reach at all hazards. The horses very likely might not be able to get to it, but, at all events, the men would, the current bearing them right down to it. Just at that moment, Tom Austin's horse gave a smothered neigh and disappeared. His master, freeing his feet from the stirrups, began to swim vigorously. "Hang on to my saddle," called Glenarvan. "Thanks, your honor, but I have good stout arms." "Robert, how is your horse going?" asked his lordship, turning to young Grant. "Famously, my lord, he swims like a fish." "Look out!" shouted the major in a stentorian voice. The warning was scarcely spoken before the enormous billow, a monstrous wave 40 feet high, broke over the fugitives with a fearful noise. Men and animals all disappeared in a whirl of foam. A liquid mass, weighing several millions of tons, engulfed them in its seething waters. When it had rolled on, the men reappeared on the surface and counted each other rapidly. But all the horses, except Theayuka, who still bore his master, had gone down forever. "Courage, courage," repeated Glenarvan, supporting Paganel with one arm and swimming with the other. I can manage," said the worthy savant. "I am even not sorry." But no one ever knew what he was not sorry about, for the poor man was obliged to swallow down the rest of his sentence with half a pint of muddy water. The major advanced quietly, making regular strokes, worthy of a master swimmer. The sailors took to the water like porpoises, while Robert clung to Theayuka's mane and was carried along with him. The noble animal swam superbly, instinctively making for the tree in a straight line. The tree was only 20 fathoms off, and in a few minutes was safely reached by the whole party. But for this refuge, they must all have perished in the flood. The water had risen to the top of the trunk, just to where the parent branches fork out. It was consequently quite easy to clamber up to it. Thalcave climbed up first, and got off his horse to hoist up Robert and help the others. His powerful arms had soon placed all the exhausted swimmers in a place of security. But meantime, Theayuka was being rapidly carried away by the current. He turned his intelligent face toward his master, and, shaking his long mane, neighed as if to summon him to his rescue. "Are you going to forsake him, Thalcave?" asked Paganel. "Aye," replied the Indian, and forthwith he plunged down into the tumultuous waters and came up again 10 fathoms off. A few instants afterward his arms were round Theayuka's neck, and master and steed were drifting together toward the misty horizon of the north. Chapter 23: A Singular Abode. The tree on which Glenarvan and his companions had just found refuge resembled a walnut tree, having the same glossy foliage and rounded form. In reality, however, it was the ombu, which grows solitarily on the Argentine plains. The enormous and twisted trunk of this tree is planted firmly in the soil, not only by its great roots but still more by its vigorous shoots, which fasten it down in the most tenacious manner. This was how it stood proof against the shock of the mighty billow. This ombu measured in height 100 feet, and covered with its shadow a circumference of 120 yards. All this scaffolding rested on 3 great boughs which sprang from the trunk. 2 of these rose almost perpendicularly, and supported the immense parasol of foliage, the branches of which were so crossed and intertwined and entangled, as if by the hand of a basket-maker, that they formed an impenetrable shade. The third arm, on the contrary, stretched right out in a horizontal position above the roaring waters, into which the lower leaves dipped. There was no want of room in the interior of this gigantic tree, for there were great gaps in the foliage, perfect glades, with air in abundance and freshness everywhere. To see the innumerable branches rising to the clouds, and the creepers running from bough to bough, and attaching them together while the sunlight glinted here and there among the leaves, one might have called it a complete forest instead of a solitary tree sheltering them all. On the arrival of the fugitives, a myriad of the feathered tribes fled away into the topmost branches, protesting by their outcries against this flagrant usurpation of their domicile. These birds, who themselves had taken refuge in the solitary ombu, were in hundreds, comprising blackbirds, starlings, isakas, hilgueros, and especially the picaflor, hummingbirds of most resplendent colors. When they flew away, it seemed as though a gust of wind had blown all the flowers off the tree. Such was the asylum offered to the little band of Glenarvan. Young Grant and the agile Wilson were scarcely perched on the tree before they had climbed to the upper branches and put their heads through the leafy dome to get a view of the vast horizon. The ocean made by the inundations surrounded them on all sides, and far as the eye could reach, seemed to have no limits. Not a single tree was visible on the liquid plain. The ombu stood alone amid the rolling waters and trembled before them. In the distance, drifting from south to north, carried along by the impetuous torrent, They saw trees torn up by the roots, twisted branches, roofs torn off, destroyed ranchos, planks of sheds stolen by the deluge from estancias, carcasses of drowned animals, blood-stained skins, and on a shaky tree a complete family of jaguars, howling and clutching hold of their frail raft. Still farther away, a black spot almost invisible, already caught Wilson's eye. It was Thalcave and his faithful Thayuka. Thalcave, Thalcave, shouted Robert, stretching out his hands toward the courageous Patagonian. He will save himself, Mr. Robert, replied Wilson. We must go down to his lordship. Next minute they had descended the 3 stages of boughs and landed safely on the top of the trunk, where they found Glenarvan, Paganel, the Major, Austin, and Mulready, sitting either astride or in some position they found more comfortable. Wilson gave an account of their investigations aloft, and all shared his opinion with respect to Thalcave. The only question was whether it was Thalcave who would save Thayuka, or Thayuka save Thalcave. Their own situation, meantime, was much more alarming than his. No doubt the tree would be able to resist the current, but the waters might rise higher and higher, till the topmost branches were covered, for the depression of the soil made this part of the plain a deep reservoir. Glenarvan's first care, consequently, was to make notches by which to ascertain the progress of the inundation. For the present it was stationary, having apparently reached its height. This was reassuring. "And now what are we going to do?" said Glenarvan. "Make our nest, of course," replied Paganel. "Make our nest," exclaimed Robert. "Certainly, my boy, and live the life of birds, since we can't that of fishes." "All very well, but who will fill our bills for us?" said Glenarvan. "I will," said the Major. All eyes turned toward him immediately, and there he sat in a natural armchair, formed of 2 elastic boughs, holding out his alforges damp but still intact. "Oh, McNabbs, that's just like you," exclaimed Glenarvan. "You think of everything even under circumstances which would drive all out of your head." Since it was settled we were not going to be drowned, I had no intention of starving of hunger. "I should have thought of it too," said Paganel, "but I am so distrait." "And what is in the alforges?" asked Tom Austin. "Food enough to last 7 men for 2 days," replied McNabbs. "And I hope the inundation will have gone down in 24 hours, said Glenarvan. "Or that we shall have found some way of regaining terra firma," added Paganel. "Our first business, then, now is to breakfast," said Glenarvan. "I suppose you mean after we have made ourselves dry," observed the Major. "And where's the fire?" asked Wilson. "We must make it," returned Paganel. "Where?" "On the top of the trunk, of course." "And what with?" "With the dead wood we cut off the tree." "But how will you kindle it?" asked Glenarvan. "Our tinder is just like wet sponge." "We can dispense with it," replied Paganel. "We only want a little dry moss and a ray of sunshine, and the lens of my telescope, and you'll see what a fire I'll get to dry myself by. Who will go and cut wood in the forest?" "I will," said Robert. And off he scampered like a young cat into the depths of the foliage, followed by his friend Wilson. Paganel set to work to find dry moss, and had soon gathered sufficient. This he laid on a bed of damp leaves, just where the large branches began to fork out, forming a natural hearth, where there was little fear of conflagration. Robert and Wilson speedily reappeared, each with an armful of dry wood which they threw on the moss. By the help of the lens it was easily kindled, for the sun was blazing overhead. In order to ensure a proper draught, Paganel stood over the hearth with his long legs straddled out in the Arab manner. Then stooping down and raising himself with a rapid motion, he made a violent current of air with his poncho, which made the wood take fire, and soon a bright flame roared in the improvised brazier. After drying themselves, each in his own fashion, and hanging their ponchos on the tree, where they were swung to and fro in the breeze, they breakfasted, carefully however rationing out the provisions, for the morrow had to be thought of. The immense basin might not empty so soon as Glenarvan expected, and anyway, the supply was very limited. The ombu produced no fruit, though fortunately, it would likely abound in fresh eggs, thanks to the numerous nests stowed away among the leaves, not to speak of their feathered proprietors. These resources were by no means to be despised. The next business was to install themselves as comfortably as they could, in prospect of a long stay. "As the kitchen and dining room are on the ground floor," said Paganel, "we must sleep on the first floor. The house is large, and as the rent is not dear, we must not cramp ourselves for room. I can see up yonder natural cradles, in which once safely tucked up we shall sleep as if we were in the best beds in the world. We have nothing to fear. Besides, we will watch, and we are numerous enough to repulse a fleet of Indians and other wild animals. We only want firearms. I have my revolvers, said Glenarvan. And I have mine, replied Roberts. But what's the good of them, said Tom Austin, unless Monsieur Paganel can find out some way of making powder. We don't need it, replied McNabbs, exhibiting a powder flask in a perfect state of preservation. Where did you get it from, Major? Asked Paganel. From Thalcave. He thought it might be useful to us, and gave it to me before he plunged into the water to save Theuka. Generous, brave Indian, exclaimed Glenarvan. Yes, replied Tom Austin, if all the Patagonians are cut after the same pattern, I must compliment Patagonia. I protest against leaving out the horse, said Paganel. He is part and parcel of the Patagonian, and I'm much mistaken if we don't see them again, the one on the other's back. What distance are we from the Atlantic? Asked the Major. About 40 miles at the outside, replied Paganel. And now, friends, since this is Liberty Hall, I beg to take leave of you. I am going to choose an observatory for myself up there, and by the help of my telescope, let you know how things are going on in the world.